Why does President Trump have any standing to lecture anyone about fraud? Think about that for a second. He was criminally convicted by a unanimous jury of his peers on 34 different felony counts of falsifying business records to conceal illegal payments he made. He was found guilty of defrauding the state of New York by lying about real estate values, and he owes hundreds of millions of dollars in ill-gotten gains to the people of New York. But now he wants to distract us from their sweeping attack on the health care rights of the people by claiming to be enemies of fraud. What a joke. The president just used his pardon power to commute the sentence and forgive the fines of a fellow criminal convict who defrauded the government of $1 billion by exploiting nursing homes and other senior care health facilities. One of the biggest frauds ever.
Watch Jamie Raskin absolutely obliterate the moral foundation upon which Trump and his Republican apparatchiks have built their latest grotesque theater of hypocritical fraud prosecution. And we are witnessing the apotheosis of American kleptocratic oligarchy, the terminal stage of a political movement that has abandoned any pretense of democratic accountability in favor of raw plutocratic power dispensed through the pardon pen. And we need to understand what this moment represents, because it is not simply corruption in the traditional sense, but rather the systematic deconstruction of the principle that laws apply equally to all citizens, rich and poor, connected and marginalized. And when you watch Raskin systematically dismantle Trump's standing to even speak the word fraud, you are watching something that should be seared into the political consciousness of every single person who cares about justice in this country, because Trump was found guilty on all 34 counts of falsifying business records, making him the first former U.S. president to be convicted of a felony, and that is not Democratic spin or partisan narrative, but verified historical fact, adjudicated by a unanimous jury of ordinary citizens who examined the evidence and concluded that this man systematically committed fraud to conceal illegal payments designed to manipulate an election, and yet here he stands on his bully pulpit, claiming to be the guardian against fraud, the protector of Medicare integrity, and it would be laughable if it weren't so catastrophically dangerous. But the indictment Raskin delivers cuts even deeper than the criminal conviction, and this is where the bombshell gets exponentially more explosive, because Trump didn't just commit fraud himself, he was also found civilly liable for defrauding New York by systematically lying about real estate values to enrich himself and his family, a scheme so brazen that he owes hundreds of millions of dollars in ill-gotten gains to the people of New York, money extracted through systematic deception, and yet Republicans want us to believe this man when he claims to care about healthcare fraud, when he postures as the enemy of those who steal from vulnerable Americans. And here is where we need to pause and recognize the sheer audacity of what is happening, because Trump granted a commutation to Philip S. Formas, a Florida healthcare executive convicted in 2019 of a $1.3 billion Medicare and Medicaid fraud scheme. And this wasn't some minor bookkeeping error or regulatory disagreement, but according to the Department of Justice, one of the largest healthcare fraud schemes in United States history, a billion-dollar operation that systematically defrauded Medicare and Medicaid programs designed to provide healthcare to elderly and disabled Americans. And Trump looked at that conviction, looked at that systematic theft from the most vulnerable, and said this man deserves to walk free. Let that sink in for a moment, because we are about to cascade through revelation after revelation. Trump also granted a commutation to Salomon Melgen, a Florida eye doctor who was serving a 17-year prison sentence for defrauding Medicare of $42 million by falsely diagnosing patients with eye diseases, then giving them unnecessary care, including laser treatments and painful eye injections. And the cruelty embedded in that particular fraud is almost incomprehensible, because Melgen didn't just steal money from taxpayers, he subjected vulnerable patients who came to him fearing blindness to medically unnecessary procedures, painful interventions they didn't need, exploiting their fear and trust for personal enrichment, and Trump erased his accountability, commuted his sentence, sent him home as if 17 years for systematically torturing patients in pursuit of Medicare fraud was somehow excessive punishment, and this pattern is not anomalous, but systematic, because Trump has granted pardons or commutations to at least 68 people convicted of fraud crimes or of interfering with fraud investigation, and we are talking about a wholesale dismantling of accountability for white-collar criminals, who prey on the healthcare system, who exploit the elderly, who steal from programs designed to protect the most vulnerable members of our society. Now here comes the avalanche of recent revelations that make this commentary urgently necessary right now in December 2025, because Trump's pardons removed the requirement that these individuals pay restitution and fines, costing their victims an estimated $1.3 billion. And that figure is so staggering, it almost becomes abstract, until you realize what it means in concrete terms, which is that victims of massive fraud schemes, people who were defrauded by criminals who were convicted in court and ordered to pay restitution, will now receive nothing because Trump waved his presidential pen and erased not just the prison sentences, but the financial accountability, the money owed to those who were victimized. Lawrence Duran, owner of American Therapeutic Corp., a Miami-area mental health company, was convicted of multiple counts related to healthcare fraud and was sentenced to 50 years in prison and $87.5 million in restitution, and Trump granted him clemency, which means that $87.5 million that was supposed to be returned to the government programs he defrauded will now never be recovered, victims will never be made whole, and the message sent to every other potential healthcare fraudster is unmistakable, which is that if you can get close enough to power, if you can demonstrate loyalty or make the right donations, accountability simply evaporates. And speaking of donations, here is where the corruption becomes so naked it is almost offensive in its transparency, because Trump pardoned Trevor Milton in March, and Milton had donated hundreds of thousands to a pro-Trump group in 2024, and Milton was the founder of Nikola, who was convicted of fraud for lying to investors about his electric truck company, and the pardon came after substantial financial support flowed to Trump's political operation. Trump disproportionately pardoned the powerful, famous, well-connected, and wealthy accused of white-collar crime, which represents a systematic preference for elite criminals over the working-class people rotting in prison for non-violent drug offenses, and this is class warfare conducted through the pardon power, the construction of a two-tiered justice system where wealth and political connection provide immunity from consequences while poor people, disproportionately Black and brown Americans, face the full punitive force of the carceral state. Now let's connect this directly to what is happening right now this very week in December 2025, as this commentary goes out, because Republicans are simultaneously pardoning billionaire healthcare fraudsters while claiming they need to gut healthcare programs to eliminate fraud, and Republicans are allowing Enhanced Affordable Care Act subsidies to expire on December 31st, which will raise insurance premiums for millions of people, and the subsidies will lapse for an estimated 22 million people who get their healthcare insurance through the Affordable Care Act marketplace, and Republicans are justifying this by claiming they are fighting fraud in the ACA, claiming the system is too expensive, claiming they need to root out waste, and yet when actual massive fraud is prosecuted and convicted, they pardon the perpetrators, they erase the accountability, they send the billion-dollar thieves home with their fortunes intact, while simultaneously arguing that ordinary Americans should lose their healthcare subsidies because the system costs too much. The hypocrisy is so complete, it borders on the surreal, and Trump on Tuesday told Congress not to waste time on an extension of the enhanced subsidies, writing, "The only healthcare I will support or approve is sending the money directly back to the people," and what this means in practice is destroying the regulated insurance marketplace and replacing it with a system where people get cash they can spend on whatever they want, which sounds like freedom, until you realize it will cause a death spiral, where healthy people drop coverage and use the money for other things, leaving only sick, expensive patients in the insurance pool, which will cause premiums to skyrocket until the entire market collapses, which is precisely the point, because Republicans have spent 15 years trying to destroy the Affordable Care Act, and now they have found a backdoor method through Trump's healthcare fraud pardons, creating a permission structure to claim the system is broken, while simultaneously ensuring that those who actually commit healthcare fraud face no consequences whatsoever. The intellectual dishonesty is staggering, but it serves a clear ideological purpose rooted in decades of conservative movement strategy, going back to the Reagan Revolution, and the systematic effort to dismantle the New Deal and Great Society programs that provide social insurance against the vagaries of capitalism. And what we are watching is the application of disaster capitalism in real time, the deliberate creation of crisis in healthcare markets, followed by the imposition of privatized alternatives that benefit wealthy investors and insurance company executives, while leaving ordinary Americans exposed to bankruptcy and death from treatable conditions, and the pardon power becomes a tool in this broader project, because by systematically pardoning those who commit massive healthcare fraud, Trump sends an unmistakable message, which is that the only fraud that matters, the only fraud that will be prosecuted, is the imaginary fraud committed by poor people seeking healthcare assistance, while the real fraud, the billion-dollar schemes perpetrated by wealthy connected executives, will be forgiven and forgotten. Let's examine the specific mechanics of what Raskin is exposing here, because he identifies a particular case that deserves sustained attention, and while Raskin references a guy, a fellow criminal convict who defrauded the government of $1 billion by exploiting nursing homes and other senior care health facilities. He is almost certainly referring to Philip S. Formas, convicted in 2019 of a $1.3 billion Medicare and Medicaid fraud scheme, and the details of the S. Formas case are genuinely horrifying because this wasn't abstract financial crime, but involved actual nursing homes and assisted living facilities where elderly and disabled patients were housed, and the scheme involved bribing doctors to refer patients to these facilities, and then billing Medicare and Medicaid for services that were unnecessary or never provided, and patients were essentially held captive in these facilities, generating fraudulent billing while receiving substandard care. And after S. Formas was sentenced, DOJ announced that the man behind one of the biggest healthcare frauds in history will be spending 20 years in prison, but Trump freed him 14 months later. And think about what that means in human terms. Think about the families who entrusted their elderly parents and grandparents to facilities that were systematically defrauding the government while providing inadequate care. Think about the patients who suffered because profit maximization took priority over basic human dignity. And here is the kicker that should infuriate anyone paying attention, because Philip S. Formas, whose Medicare fraud sentence was commuted by Trump, was arrested on domestic violence-related charges over the weekend in October 2024, and S. Formas is at least the seventh person who received executive clemency from Trump and has since been charged with new crimes, which means Trump's pardon judgment is not only morally bankrupt but practically disastrous, because he is releasing violent criminals back into society, people who commit massive fraud and then commit additional crimes after being pardoned. And yet Republicans want us to believe they are the party of law and order, the party that will protect us from crime, when in reality they are systematically dismantling accountability for the wealthy, while maintaining a police state for the poor and working class. The political timing of this makes the hypocrisy even more acute, because we are in the immediate aftermath of Trump's return to power, and dozens of people were pardoned, including convicted fraudsters, and Raskin wrote that it at least appears that you are using the office of the pardon attorney to dole out pardons as favors to the president's loyal political followers and most generous donors, completely ignoring and abandoning the thousands of individual applications for clemency in the normal process. And this represents a systematic corruption of the pardon process, which historically involved a structured review by the Justice Department, examining factors like acceptance of responsibility and time served, and whether the punishment was excessive relative to the crime. But Trump has completely bypassed that process in favor of a system that rewards political loyalty and financial contributions, and punishes those who cooperate with investigations or criticize his administration. What makes this particularly insidious right now in December 2025 is that Republican lawmakers say key parts of the ACA cost taxpayers too much and provide incentive for fraud, and they are using allegations of fraud in the ACA marketplace to justify allowing subsidies to expire, even though a controversial report from a conservative think tank estimates millions of people may be misstating their incomes and getting generous ACA subsidies, but the report's methodology has been questioned, and the actual evidence of systematic fraud in the ACA marketplace is thin to non-existent compared to the documented billion-dollar fraud schemes perpetrated by the healthcare executives Trump has pardoned. And yet the political narrative has been inverted so that imaginary fraud by poor people justifies gutting healthcare assistance, while actual massive fraud by wealthy executives deserves clemency. And this inversion is not accidental, but represents a deliberate ideological project to dismantle social insurance while protecting plutocratic criminality. The philosophical implications here connect to broader questions about the rule of law and democratic legitimacy that political theorists from Locke to Rawls have grappled with, which is fundamentally about whether law applies equally to all citizens or whether we have reverted to a feudal system where different classes of people are subject to different systems of accountability. And what Trump's pardon spree demonstrates, that we are constructing a neo-feudal order where wealthy, connected individuals exist above the law, while ordinary citizens are subjected to increasingly punitive enforcement, and this should be understood as an existential threat to Republican government in the classical sense, because the entire premise of representative democracy is that no one is above the law, that power is constrained by legal accountability, and when that principle collapses, the entire system becomes vulnerable to authoritarian capture. Raskin's critique also implicitly invokes the concept of standing, which in legal terms refers to whether someone has the right to bring a particular claim, but Raskin uses it in the moral sense, asking how Trump has any standing to lecture anyone about fraud when he himself is a convicted fraudster. And this is a devastating rhetorical move, because it exposes the bad faith at the heart of Republican healthcare policy, which is that they don't actually care about fraud, They care about using allegations of fraud as a weapon to dismantle programs they ideologically oppose, while protecting actual fraudsters who support their political project. And this kind of bad faith argumentation corrodes public discourse and makes good faith policy negotiation impossible, because if your political opponents don't actually believe what they claim to believe, then there is no basis for compromise or consensus building, and we descend into pure power politics, where might makes right and the only thing that matters is who controls the levers of state power. And we need to be absolutely clear about what is at stake materially for millions of Americans right now, because nearly 5 million people will lose access to health care when the ACA's tax credits expire in December, and nearly 9,000 people will die every year without an extension, and Republicans chose not to extend these ACA tax credits, even though an extension would benefit all working people including those in their districts, and those are not abstract numbers, but represent actual human beings who will lose insurance coverage, who will delay medical care because they cannot afford it, who will die from treatable conditions because they cannot access the healthcare system, and this is happening while Trump pardons billionaires who stole more money from healthcare programs than it would cost to extend the subsidies, and the cruelty of that juxtaposition, the sheer moral bankruptcy of valuing the freedom of wealthy criminals over the lives of ordinary Americans, should provoke mass mobilization and sustained political resistance, but instead we see Republican voters supporting these policies because decades of right-wing media conditioning has taught them to fear and resent poor people seeking government assistance while ignoring or celebrating the massive theft perpetrated by wealthy elites. The healthcare fraud pardon scandal also intersects with Trump's broader assault on democratic accountability, which includes Trump and the Department of Justice violating federal law as they continue covering up facts about Jeffrey Epstein's decades-long international sex trafficking ring, with the DOJ failing to release all Epstein files by the legal deadline set by the Epstein Files Transparency Act. And this represents a systematic pattern where Trump uses executive power to shield the powerful from accountability, whether they are healthcare fraudsters or sex traffickers or corrupt politicians. Trump has pardoned historic numbers of elected officials, and typically crimes involving public corruption are taken very seriously, but Trump is normalizing public corruption by liberally pardoning corrupt public officials who abused their political offices to enrich themselves, and this systematic corruption of accountability mechanisms threatens the basic functioning of democratic institutions, because if voters cannot trust that corrupt officials will face consequences, then elections become meaningless rituals that change nothing about the actual distribution of power and wealth. The cascade of corruption continues because Trump has granted clemency to 7 federal elected politicians and 9 state and local politicians convicted of corruption charges, and these include figures like Rod Blagojevich, who was convicted of multiple political corruption charges, including seeking to sell Barack Obama's old Senate seat, and Trump pardoned him, saying his conviction shouldn't have happened. Scott Jenkins, former Virginia sheriff convicted of accepting more than $75,000 in bribes in exchange for appointing people as auxiliary deputies, and sentenced to 10 years in federal prison, and Trump pardoned him, claiming he was a victim of overzealous Biden DOJ, and what unites all these pardons is that they reward people who demonstrated loyalty to Trump, or who Trump views as fellow victims of what he characterizes as a weaponized justice system, even though these are people who were convicted by juries after examining evidence in court proceedings that provided due process and the ability to present a defense. The ideological through-line connecting all these pardons is a particular conservative theory of state power that views law enforcement as legitimate only when directed against marginalized populations, the poor, immigrants, people of color, protesters, but illegitimate when directed against wealthy white men who hold or held positions of power and authority, and this is fundamentally a theory of hierarchical social order, rooted in pre-Enlightenment conceptions of natural aristocracy, where some people are entitled to rule, and others are meant to be ruled, and accountability applies only to the latter category. And what makes this particularly dangerous in the American context is that it represents a complete rejection of the founding principle that all men are created equal and are endowed with certain unalienable rights, and instead substitutes a system of privilege and immunity based on wealth, political connection, and demonstrated loyalty to the authoritarian leader. What Raskin is doing in this clip that has gone viral is performing a crucial democratic function, which is speaking truth to power in a moment when power is systematically trying to obscure truth through a blizzard of bad faith arguments and rhetorical misdirection, and when he asks why does President Trump have any standing to lecture anyone about fraud, he is cutting through that misdirection and forcing us to confront the fundamental hypocrisy and corruption at the heart of Republican governance, and this kind of moral clarity is essential in a moment of democratic crisis, because authoritarianism depends on confusion, on the erosion of shared reality, on making people feel that truth is unknowable, and that all politicians are equally corrupt, so why bother resisting? And what Raskin demonstrates is that this cynicism is unwarranted, that there are actually meaningful differences between political parties and leaders, that some are systematically more corrupt than others, and that we can and must hold them accountable. The healthcare dimension of this scandal is particularly acute because we are living through a moment where Trump and Republicans have passed a law that will slash $1 trillion from Medicaid, and these cuts aren't just numbers but represent colleagues, students and neighbors who are losing care, putting thousands of lives at risk every year. And Medicaid is the healthcare lifeline for millions of Americans, including many who work in essential jobs that don't provide employer-sponsored insurance: teachers, home healthcare workers, restaurant workers, retail employees, and the Republican project is to systematically dismantle that lifeline while simultaneously pardoning those who defrauded the very same programs. And the message this sends is that healthcare is not a right, but a privilege reserved for those who can afford to pay market rates or who are connected enough to avoid consequences when they steal from public programs. Looking at this through the lens of political economy reveals that what we are witnessing is the construction of what economists would call a predatory state, where public institutions exist primarily to be looted by private interests rather than to provide public goods, and the pardon power becomes a crucial tool in this project, because it ensures that those who successfully loot public programs face no consequences, thereby encouraging more looting and creating a self-reinforcing cycle of corruption and impunity. And this model of governance has been tried repeatedly throughout history in kleptocratic regimes from Mobutu's Zaire to Putin's Russia, and the outcomes are always the same, which is economic stagnation, massive inequality, the collapse of public institutions, and the erosion of social trust, to the point where collective action becomes impossible and society fragments into competing patronage networks. The timing of Raskin's intervention is also crucial, because we are heading into the 2026 midterm elections, and Democrats need to make an affirmative case, not just against Trump's corruption, but for a positive vision of healthcare as a human right, for systematic accountability for white-collar crime, for a justice system that treats wealthy executives the same as poor defendants, and the healthcare fraud pardon scandal provides the perfect vehicle for that argument, because it allows Democrats to connect abstract principles about equality and justice to concrete examples of Republican hypocrisy and cruelty, and to demonstrate that when Republicans talk about fighting fraud, they mean punishing poor people for seeking healthcare assistance, while when Democrats talk about fighting fraud, they mean actually prosecuting the billion-dollar schemes that steal from public programs. What makes this moment particularly dangerous is that Trump fired the Justice Department career attorney who led the Office of the Pardon Attorney and installed political loyalist Ed Martin, who described the rationale for granting pardons as "no MAGA left behind," and the former official testified that the leadership of the Department of Justice appears to value political loyalty above the fair and responsible administration of justice, and this represents the complete corruption of institutions that are supposed to operate independently of political pressure. And when the Justice Department becomes an arm of partisan political warfare, rather than a neutral enforcer of law, then the entire system of accountability collapses, and we are left with might makes right authoritarianism, where whoever controls the executive branch can protect their allies and persecute their enemies without constraint. The cascade of consequences flowing from this systematic corruption is genuinely terrifying, if you think through the implications, because if wealthy healthcare executives know they can commit massive fraud and receive pardons as long as they demonstrate political loyalty, then the incentive structure is completely inverted and fraud becomes rational profit-maximizing behavior, and we should expect to see more massive healthcare fraud schemes going forward, not fewer, because the expected cost of committing fraud has declined dramatically when you can buy immunity through political contributions and loyalty demonstrations. Meanwhile, ordinary Americans will see their healthcare costs rise and their access to care diminish, because the same political movement pardoning fraudsters is also gutting the subsidies and regulations that make healthcare affordable and accessible, and we end up in a nightmare scenario where the healthcare system exists primarily to extract wealth from sick and vulnerable people while providing minimal actual care. The philosophical tradition of democratic republicanism, going back to Aristotle and Cicero, and forward through Madison and Jefferson, emphasizes that republics fail when citizens lose civic virtue and begin using public office for private gain, and what Trump's pardon spree represents is the complete abandonment of civic virtue in favor of a transactional model of politics where everything is for sale, including justice itself, and this is the antithesis of Republican government, and represents a reversion to the kind of corrupt monarchical system that the American Revolution was fought to overthrow. And the fact that this is happening under Republican leadership reveals the emptiness of conservative rhetoric about constitutional originalism and limited government, because what they actually support is unlimited executive power, as long as it is exercised by their partisan allies in service of their ideological and material interests. Raskin's intervention is important, not just because it exposes hypocrisy, but because it provides a template for how Democrats should be talking about Republican governance, which is with moral clarity, with righteous indignation, with systematic documentation of the gap between rhetoric and reality, and this kind of prosecutorial approach to political communication is essential because it doesn't allow Republicans to hide behind abstractions and generalities, but forces them to defend specific indefensible actions, like pardoning billionaire, healthcare fraudsters while claiming to oppose healthcare fraud, and when you force that confrontation, most voters will recognize the hypocrisy and corruption because it is so blatant and undeniable. But we also need to understand that exposure alone is insufficient, because Republican voters have been conditioned by decades of right-wing media to distrust any information that contradicts their partisan worldview, and to interpret evidence of Republican corruption as proof that the system is biased against conservatives, and this creates an epistemological trap where evidence of corruption actually strengthens partisan loyalty rather than weakening it, because it confirms the narrative that conservatives are under siege from a hostile establishment, and the only solution is to circle the wagons and support Trump more fervently, regardless of what crimes he commits or who he pardons, and breaking through this epistemic closure requires not just better arguments, but systematic reconstruction of information environments and trust in institutions, which is a generational project, not a single election cycle. Nevertheless, the immediate political imperative is to ensure that every voter understands what is happening right now in December 2025, which is that Republicans are simultaneously pardoning billionaire healthcare fraudsters and allowing healthcare subsidies for millions of Americans to expire, and that these two actions are connected because they reflect the same underlying values which prioritize the freedom and wealth of connected elites over the health and well-being of ordinary people, and Democrats need to make this connection explicit in every speech, every ad, every town hall, every door knock, because it crystallizes the fundamental choice voters face, which is between a party that believes healthcare is a human right and will prosecute those who defraud healthcare programs, and a party that believes healthcare is a commodity and will pardon those who steal billions from public programs as long as they demonstrate sufficient political loyalty. The historical parallel that keeps coming to mind is the Gilded Age, when robber barons systematically looted the American economy, while politicians in both parties, but especially Republicans, provided cover and legal immunity through corrupt bargains, and what ultimately broke that system was a combination of muckraking journalism, exposing the corruption, progressive political organizing, building a mass movement for reform, and eventually the election of leaders like Theodore Roosevelt, who were willing to use state power against concentrated wealth. And we are in a similar moment now. The corruption is obvious and systematic, but political will to confront it remains insufficient, because too many Democrats are still committed to a fantasy of bipartisan comedy and normal political competition, when what we actually face is an authoritarian movement that has abandoned any commitment to democratic norms or legal accountability. Raskin represents a different model of democratic politics that is willing to call corruption what it is, to speak with moral clarity about the stake, to prosecute the case against Republican governance with the kind of sustained indignation that the situation warrants, and if Democrats want to win in 2026 and 2028, they need to follow his example and make the election a referendum on Republican corruption and democratic accountability, on healthcare as a right versus healthcare as a privilege, on a justice system that applies equally to all versus a system of elite immunity and mass incarceration, and the healthcare fraud pardon scandal provides the perfect vehicle for that argument, because it is so egregious and so well documented and so obviously hypocritical that even low-information voters can understand it if Democrats are willing to talk about it loudly and persistently. The ultimate question is whether American democracy can survive a political movement that has completely abandoned commitment to legal accountability and institutional integrity in favor of authoritarian strongman rule, and the answer depends on whether enough Americans recognize the threat, are mobilized to resist it, and whether Democratic politicians are willing to fight with the kind of moral urgency that the moment demands, and Raskin's clip suggests that at least some Democrats understand what we are facing and are willing to name it and confront it, but whether that becomes the party's dominant strategy or remains a minority position will determine whether we successfully defend democratic institutions or slide further into authoritarianism, and the clock is ticking as healthcare subsidies expire and millions lose coverage while billionaire fraudsters walk free, and the message is sent that in Trump's America justice is for sale, and accountability is for suckers, and the only thing that matters is power and loyalty, and the willingness to abandon any principle in service of the authoritarian project.